So I wanted to talk tonight about the source of compassion. And as you know, we talk a lot about compassion here. It's one of the four Brahma Viharas, or heavenly abodes. We just had a series on the Brahma Viharas, which in addition to compassion include sympathetic or empathetic joy, equanimity, and loving kindness or metta. But the question I want us to address tonight is, where does compassion originate? How do we cultivate it? Where does it come from? Is it a natural human tendency? And there's been, in addition to the Buddha talking about it, when I went to the canon, to the Pali canon, and did a search, an online search, it's just, in almost every one of his teachings, there's some reference to compassion. I mean, it was that central to his whole message. And it's probably been so throughout human history in some ways. I mean, it's probably critical, and I'll talk a little bit about this in a moment, to our survival as a species and our tribal behavior. But there's been decades of research on it, and modern psychology's looked at it as well, and looked at human suffering and the role of compassion in that. And as you know, in terms of the Four Noble Truths, that our practice is really grounded in the alleviation of suffering. It's really about how do we alleviate or lessen our suffering. But contrary to that suffering, we see, and often accompanying that suffering, are just beautiful acts of compassion by others wishing to help relieve it and relieve our suffering. I mean, there's just countless examples of that. Statistic from the Department of Labor in 2012, which was the most recent data, 26.5% of Americans volunteered in some capacity. Now, we wouldn't necessarily argue that was all driven by compassion, but I think a great deal of it was, and some component of most of it probably was. So what propels us, or someone to serve food at a homeless shelter, or pull over on the highway when someone's broken down, or feed a stray cat, or volunteer at the SPCA? I mean, what's the driving force there? And is this thing, if it is in fact compassion that drives that, is it different from both either empathy or altruism? Are they all synonymous terms? But I think very often we confuse the definition of compassion with that of empathy, and I'll make it may be a subtle, but I think it's an important distinction. So empathy is usually defined as the visceral or emotional experience of another person's feelings, usually painful in nature. So in some ways, it's that automatic mirroring of another's emotions. It's sort of like when we tear up at someone else's sadness. If you remember the research on mirror neurons, and I won't get into that, except, we have these neurons which respond, as do other higher primates, in a mirror way to others' emotions. And it fires both when someone acts and when the observer basically feels the same action or the same emotional response. So it's a mirroring that happens between two primates primarily. And altruism is, on the other hand, an action that benefits someone else. That's donating money, serving food at the soup kitchen, volunteering at the SPCA, and so forth. And altruism may or may not be accompanied by empathy or compassion. If you think of what's the motivation if I donate a lot of money to get a tax deduction? I mean, maybe that is true altruism. Is it a tax deduction? Is it for self-aggrandizement if I give a big chunk of money to the museum to have my name displayed outside? I mean, it gets to be complicated in terms of our motivation. And compassion typically does involve both an empathic response, and it may also involve altruistic behavior. So in some ways it can subsume both other qualities and really become sort of the whole package. So then back to the original question, what is the source of it? What is the source of this capacity that we have for compassion? Is it hardwired into us as a species, or do we have to learn it? Is it acquired? Is it something that we learn through social interaction, through social behavior with our caretakers, with our friends, with our community? And then the question becomes, why are some people compassionate and others not so much? I mean, does that mean that it's hardwired and yet we learn not to have it? We get hardened in a way that culture or our life experiences that takes it out of us? You know, why do some people have a strong reaction to children being separated from their parents at the border, and other people seem indifferent to that or seem to justify that, if you want to use that as an example of a lack of compassion? And you could argue whether that's a valid example or not. But there are countless numbers of situations where people can have very different responses, some highly compassionate, some seemingly indifferent. So, as best I could tell from the current research, including some neuroscience imaging studies of the brain under different conditions, it strongly suggests that we are hardwired with what has been called a compassionate instinct. In other words, it's a natural and automatic predisposition that has ensured our survival. It's not necessarily always going to be there, but we have this predisposition toward compassion. But the predisposition doesn't guarantee that it will manifest. It doesn't guarantee that we'll acquire it or develop it or even express it or feel it. I didn't know this, but apparently Darwin's work has been described as survival of the kindest as opposed to survival of the fittest. And he says in his writings, quote, "Communities which included the greater number of the most sympathetic members would flourish best and rear the greatest number of offspring," close quotes. That quote really resonated with me. So it's a naturally evolved and adaptive trait. Without it, as I said a little while ago, we probably would not have survived as a species. I mean, just think of it. You know, you're sitting around the fire, someone's struggling with something, they're a member of your tribe, and you're sort of indifferent to their suffering, or they're being attacked by another tribe member, whatever. I mean, there are countless ways in which compassion probably informed our survival as a species. But enough with the science. I just wanted to give you the background and some scientific context. So how do we understand it as it relates to our practice? How do we understand it as an important and central component to our practice, which the Buddha talked about again and again and again? And I would say that in addition to this hardwired predisposition, that one of the ways that I believe that our compassionate instinct gets activated is not just when we encounter the suffering of others, but when we experience our own suffering. That our own suffering becomes a wellspring for cultivating compassion. You may remember that the Buddha described compassion as a quivering of the heart in response to the suffering of others. And I love that characterization. I think it's just a perfect metaphor for this experience of compassion, the heart quivering. But as I said, I would also argue that it could be born of our own suffering. But there's a big if there, and that is if we allow it. Because there's always a tendency when we're suffering to shut down, to withdraw, to judge ourselves harshly, to feel very negative about ourselves, feel weak, what's wrong with me, why am I suffering? So the challenge is to allow that suffering through our practice, through our mindfulness, through our awareness, to transform into a greater capacity for compassion. And I know in my own life, in terms of my own psychological struggles, that it has eventually, after much struggle, made me a much more compassionate person, and I think as a professional, much more compassionate as a psychologist. But, that was not always so. I mean, I went through years of self-judgment about it, of resentment about it, of anger about it, of cynicism about it, of feeling that it was unfair, all the usual things that are there for many of us when we find ourselves suffering greatly. But the practice can change it. It can transform it. The wisdom that comes with our practice can help us begin to see that one response to our suffering is not only deeper self-compassion, but greater compassion and a greater capacity for compassion with others. And actually with all beings for that matter. And it's the cliche there of, walking a mile in someone else's shoes, seeing their suffering, seeing our own suffering, and allowing that to really foster greater capacity in ourselves. You may know that people that are of lowest income, it's been established, give the highest proportion of their income to charity and to others. I've always found that to be a startling fact. But I think that the compassion that they show with that is born of the challenges that they themselves experience of poverty. I mean, they really get it, and they understand that suffering. And they convert that. Their own suffering in poverty increases their compassion for others who suffer likewise. And conversely, the more we have the tendencies, the more we want. We just more. Greed gets activated because it's a powerful underlying appetite is to acquire things. I mean, it's a survival mechanism, but it can quickly get out of hand, and we can start acquiring way more than we need, way more than is necessary for our survival. So I think that contrast is so revealing between people of low income that can be incredibly generous and many folks of higher income who just are about greater acquisitions. So compassion, which literally translates to suffer together, is really often called empathy in action. It's really the enactment of empathy. And again, more science, compassionate acts register physically as a decelerated heart rate, greater secretion of oxytocin, and activation of involved regions of the brain associated with caregiving, and on and on and on. So it actually also has beneficial physical and self-care effects. So again, I think the more we are open to our own pain, the greater we can, if we make the effort, develop a greater capacity for compassion. If I'm allowing myself to accept it, to accept my suffering, see it as something which is universal, that we all suffer, and that calls on us to cultivate that response in terms of what the Buddha taught, our response to others and that quivering of the heart. And again, our mindfulness practice is a big, important part of that because it brings up that awareness. It helps us sit with that pain. It helps us transform that pain into caring. So I wanted to take some time on, there's Judy, doing a little experiential exercise with this because I think that really is going to hopefully make the point. Judy's going to hand out a prompt. Judy, can I have one? I realize I didn't. Thanks. So if you would, once you have this in hand, just find a partner, and we'll do this in dyads, and sort of get off to the side a little bit or move your chair so you can have a little bit of quiet. And then once you've done that, we'll go over it a little bit, and I'll clarify some of this. Now, in the first bullet point, it doesn't have to be a major thing. I don't want you to have to bare your soul. And you don't even have to be that specific, but try to think of something that you are comfortable sharing in which an area where you've struggled or suffered. And then identify your initial response to that. Was it to become bitter, to judge yourself negatively, Did you feel greater compassion? Were you able to cultivate a sense of greater compassion toward yourself or those who are struggling with the same or a similar issue? And then think about any obstacle you encounter to feeling compassion born out of your own suffering, judging mind, cynicism, self-criticism, and whatnot. So we'll do this one person at a time. There'll be a speaker and then a listener. So I'll ring the bell, take a minute to decide who's going to speak first, and we'll give each person about 5 minutes. If you run out of time, that's fine. I mean, if you run out of stuff to talk about, that's fine. And then I'll ring the bell and you can switch roles. So. Okay, if you wrap up with your partner, and we'll come back together as a group. Yes.
When you talk about empathy versus compassion, in a family dynamic or in a therapeutic situation, how many of us feel like we are being compassionate and when we are really more in a situation of thinking that it's us that can fix it?
Yeah. You know, it's a great question. And, you know, we talk about with each of these qualities, the near enemy and the far enemy, the near enemy being the thing that's very close to it, but really not it. And and other teachers correct me, but I think the near enemy of compassion is pity. Is that right, Susan? The near enemy of compassion, pity? Yeah. And I think your question sort of drifts into that territory a little bit. You know, that I'm up here and you're down here, and I'm sort of helping you. And, you know, we see that a lot in terms of racial relations. We see that a lot therapeutic. We see it all over the place. Poverty, wealth, gender, sexual orientation. I mean, there's many ways in which we can think we're being compassionate, but we're really coming from a position of superiority, or I've got the answers and you don't. So, thank you. Anybody want to comment or share or ask a question about the exercise? I wanted to give you a chance to sort of experience or think about it, a time when you experienced this kind of transformation that we talked about tonight. Yes.
My observation is that that which I struggled with was a burden until I acknowledged it and let it inform me. And of course, that was over years
Yes.
and lots of therapy and a great sense of humor. And then I could feel compassion for others who were going through or had gone through the same thing. And then it became real. Until then, it was just this burden, this thing that I was struggling with. But now it's like a real live thing that really informs me. And I love that it changed.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. I mean, I think you just summarized the topic. Thank you. Others? Anybody else? Yes, Linda. Wait.
I noticed that my partner talked about a situation that you would probably all agree this was a struggle for a lot of people in our society. I won't say what it is because maybe she doesn't want me to. But anyway, and because she had experienced it at one time and then gradually had let it go and transformed it into not controlling her anymore. Let's just say, for example, it's a kind of an addiction. But she had more compassion for people who had it, and she's even tried to help them. And I was thinking about people with that situation, and I always judge, like, well, why are they bothered about that? That doesn't bother me. I can do blah blah blah, and I'm not hooked. But then I do think, now wait a minute, Linda, wouldn't that be hard if you had that situation? But because I haven't, and there's nobody close to me in my family or friends that have. I have a couple friends actually who have, but they never talk about it. They just said they have. I can't identify with it. I can't understand it. Whereas the stuff that bothers me, the thing I talked about to her, the situation, she has had it too, and well, because I've had it, and when I've shared it with people, I deal with it still. It's aging, you guys. Anyway, accepting my aging, especially women. They really seem to get it. And when you have it, or when you struggle with it, then it is easier to, like instead of saying it's better than the alternative now, I told her it's like, well, I'm just thankful. I kind of replace it with gratitude. And I have to say, coming here and meditating and the talks I've heard and the little bit of reading I've done really has helped me with that. It's sort of like, no, I don't have to say, well, it's better than the alternative. I can say, wait a minute, I'm really thankful that I still can. There are people my age that can't even walk, or much less swim or work or all the stuff that, so... Yeah. And my mind, I think, is still pretty good, pretty much okay, except for the memory. So, and I guess having a condition or having the struggle definitely gives us an edge on having compassion for others. And then hopefully for ourselves at some point. The meditation is what's helped me with having it for myself,
Great.
So.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other comments or thoughts? One of the areas that occurred to me when you were talking, Linda, where I think this really is applicable, or you see this so vividly, is with folks in AA or NA in recovery. You see that once they sort of transform that struggle into, and then how that results in them reaching out to others and inviting others into the program. I think that's a classic example of converting suffering into compassion in a way that's just really amazing. So, all right. Well, thanks very much for coming. Have a good evening. See you next week.